Hello, this is part 2 of my video series, Bankers Are Not Who You Think They Are. And I'm going to start this out with a speech given by Godfrey Bloom of the EU Parliament. And in it, he basically talks about how all the big European banks are bankrupt and that all the other politicians in the EU don't understand the banking system. And that's the point of my making this two-part video series, because the same extends to all the big US banks, Bank of America, Wells Fargo, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, Citigroup. They're all bankrupt if they weren't committing Enron-like fraud and really marking their assets to market instead of fantasy land value. That includes US bonds, which they never marked down when the US bond yield spiked up and the face values of all the bonds collapsed, causing billions of dollars of losses to US banks. They never wrote them down. They continue to lie. That's how they declare record profits, and quarterly earnings. They hold the vast amount of the derivatives, which if they mark to market would probably be pennies on the dollar, a very small percent of what they actually mark them as, if they even keep them on their balance sheets, because a lot of them just hold them off balance sheet, so you don't even know of the type of trouble a lot of these banks are in. So let's start off with this speech by Godfrey Bloom of the EU Parliament.
Mr. Bloom has 2 minutes.
Commissioner, Mr. President, I rise again, I'm afraid, to make the same old hoary speech that I've been making here for several years, and that is, it is my opinion that you do not really understand the concept of banking. All the banks are broke. Bank Santander, Deutsche Bank, Royal Bank of Scotland, they're all broke. And why are they broke? It isn't an act of God. It isn't some sort of tsunami. They're broke because we have a system called fractional reserve banking, which means that banks can lend money that they don't actually have. It's a criminal scandal, and it's been going on for too long. To add to that problem, you have moral hazard, a very significant moral hazard from the political sphere. And most of the problem starts in politics and central banks, which are part of the same political system. We have counterfeiting, sometimes called quantitative easing, but counterfeiting by any other name. The artificial printing of money, which if any ordinary person did, they'd go to prison for a very long time. And yet governments and central banks do it all the time. Central banks repress the amount of interest that rates are, so we don't have the real cost of money. And yet we blame the retail banks for manipulating LIBOR. The sheer effrontery of this is quite astonishing. It's central banks that manipulate interest rates, Commissioner. And plus, underneath all this, we talk loosely, in a rather cavalier fashion, do we not, about deposit guarantees. So when banks go broke through their own incompetence and chicanery, the taxpayer picks up the tab. It's theft from the taxpayer. And until we start sending bankers, and I include central bankers and politicians, to prison for this outrage, it will continue.
So basically what I really want people to understand is that there really is no difference between, say, a drug lord like Pablo Escobar or El Chapo Guzman or the Sinaloa drug cartel in Mexico, and the crime bosses of these big banks, because these big banks are basically huge global crime syndicates. So there's no difference between Escobar or Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan or Stuart Gulliver HSBC or Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs. Okay, and then let me explain why, because a lot of people aren't going to get this at first, so I feel like I should go into a little bit of detail, explain why. Now, HSBC laundered $7 billion of dirty money for the Sinaloa drug cartel, run by notoriously violent drug cartel leader El Chapo Guzman. Okay, now the Sinaloa drug cartel has been estimated to murder about 10,000 people a year over the last 8 years, so they're responsible for 80,000 homicides. Okay, now without HSBC's help, they probably wouldn't have been able to murder all those people, because you have to understand that money is no good if it's not laundered, because they can't spend it. So they can't spend it on guns and ammunition to go murder all the people, all the journalists, the politicians, the honest policemen that might be going after them. to try to bring them down. So they wouldn't have that money to spend if HSBC was not willingly laundering for it. So now why do I say willingly? Well, because the FBI said there's indisputable evidence that HSBC knew they were laundering money for the drug cartel. The two U.S. senators who found that HSBC, the Mexican subsidiary, set up a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands that had 0 offices, 0 employees, but yet 50,000 accounts of over 1.2 billion in assets. So, they're probably moving a lot of money, the dirty money, through there. These two U.S. senators said HSBC probably knew that they were laundering money, but the only person that didn't know, that says they don't know, was Stuart Gulliver, okay, the CEO of HSBC. So you have to understand that drug laundering is a 100% cash business. So they're moving billions of dollars of cash. And they say they totally ignore the KYC, know your client rule of private banking, which is to know where that money's coming from. It's all cash, and yet they don't know where it's coming from. So Gulliver doesn't know. So even a Mexican journalist, Anabel Hernandez, wrote a book called, I can't remember exactly, I think it was called Señoras del Narco, okay, which is basically drug lords. And she said when she heard this apology from Stuart Gulliver after HSBC was busted for laundering all this money, she said she was in disbelief that the bank didn't know. So she said she extensively studied the Sinaloa drug cartels, drug laundering operations, and she said she came to the conclusion there's no way that HSBC did not know they're laundering billions of dollars for the Sinaloa drug cartel. So basically, the FBI, U.S. senators, and journalists have all called Stuart Gulliver a complete bald-faced liar, and HSBC liars for saying they didn't know anything about the drug laundering operations that they were running, and thereby facilitating about 10,000 murders a year by the Sinaloa drug cartel. So, and also HSBC doesn't have the best record, because when you look at it, there are other bankers within the organization. And this all comes from the top, Stuart Gulliver, and the organizational structure, the organizational philosophy, that continue to do business with Al-Raji Bank in Saudi Arabia, even after it's discovered that one of the founders of this bank was an early benefactor of Al-Qaeda. So they're basically supporting terrorism too. As long as it's profitable, it's okay. So, if you actually sat me down and said, you have a choice, John, you have to either work for this hospital. Say you're going back in the day when Pablo Escobar was the biggest drug lord in the world, now not El Chapo Guzman. So you have to work for this hospital, and I'm going to tell you that this hospital is funded by Pablo Escobar. Or you can work for Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein, or Stuart Gulliver, and we'll give you the same exact salary. Which job would you choose? I said from a moral standpoint, I go work for Pablo Escobar, okay? Now, I'd have to think about it a little bit, but let me tell you why. Because Pablo Escobar, even though he's known as Santo Pablo, which means basically Saint Pablo in Colombia, because he created thousands of jobs, he lifted the poor in Colombia out of poverty, he gave them jobs. He was actually, his drug cartel was responsible, I think it was for, they said at 1.3% of Colombia's GDP. Their total GDP. I'm not exactly sure of that figure, but I think that sounds pretty accurate from what I can recall. So he actually created a lot of jobs. He created a lot of good organizations. So he basically built churches, schools, recreational facilities to keep young kids out of trouble in poor Colombian neighborhoods. And he built hospitals, and he gave thousands of people jobs. And good organizations that did great things for the community. So that's why he's known as Santo Pablo. Now, don't get my message wrong. I don't have any delusions that Escobar wasn't a monster, okay? Because I've read that book, News of a Kidnapping, written by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was the Nobel laureate in literature, and his only nonfiction book he wrote about Pablo Escobar. So I do understand that Pablo Escobar did a lot of bad things to a lot of people. But he also created a lot of good. So he was a dichotomy, I guess. He was a monster on one end, but he also did a lot of wonderful things for people, and that's why he's known as El Santo Pablo in Colombia, even to this day, even though he's believed to have been killed in a prison when he was serving a jail sentence many, many, many years ago. So, but when I look at the crime bosses, Jamie Dimon, the crime boss Stuart Gulliver, the crime boss Lloyd Blankfein, I see nothing redeeming that they're doing for society. Zero. They've done nothing redeeming. In fact, everything their institutions have done have created misery, more poverty all around the world. And they have been outed for thieving, stealing, cheating, deceiving their clients, deceiving others, creating misery all over the world. So, yes, Pablo Escobar created a lot of misery as well, but at least he had redeeming projects that he worked on. And some could say, and I believe this too, that he probably did a lot of this to protect himself from La Policia in Colombia that wanted to go after him. He did a lot of good deeds, and it might not have been 100% pure, but at least he was doing good. It could have been for the ulterior motives of getting some kind of layer of protection between himself and other people that were going after him. Because you have this layer of protection. Because mafia bosses have been known to do the same things, really take care of their community, so no one in their community will give them up or turn them in or tell the police about their whereabouts when they're being sought after. So, I'm sure Pablo Escobar had some of those same motivations for doing all the great deeds he did, but at least he did stuff that was good for society. So if I'm working at a hospital that is saving lives, that is helping the elderly, that is helping children. My boss is still Pablo Escobar because he 100% funded that hospital. He built the materials that lay the foundation for that hospital, and he built the whole structure, and then he gave everyone, all the doctors, jobs, administrators. If I took a job at the hospital, he would really be my boss. Okay, so it's the same thing if you're working for like an HSBC and you're not really doing anything bad, because I'm doing great things in this hospital, you have to understand. But my boss, if you're working, say, as a bank teller at JP Morgan Chase Bank, it's still Jamie Dimon. So it's the same exact situation. That's what you have to get. You have to get the significance of the analogy I'm pointing out to you. Okay? So, that's a crazy statement, right? Some people may say that's a crazy statement to say you would go work for a drug lord over a banker. But the reason is you have to understand they're the same people. They're the same people, but the only difference is, in this case with Pablo Escobar, the drug lord did great things for the community, where the bank does nothing good for the community. So in my book, that drug lord is a step above, like Jamie Dimon, Lloyd Blankfein, and he's not a good person, but he's still a step above all those global bankers. Now, you will never hear anyone refer to Jamie Dimon as Santo Jamie, or you never hear anyone refer to Lloyd Blankfein as Santo Lloyd, or to Stuart Gulliver as Santo Stuart. So you got to think about that, right? You have to think about the fact that people have been called Pablo Escobar Santo Pablo means he did a lot of good things for the community, even though he's a monster on the other side. But you couldn't find anyone in the world that referred to the head of these global banks as saints. So, you can already see the dichotomy there. You can already see, I hope you can see the point that I'm trying to make, is that if you control the media, as these bankers do, as I discussed with World Bank whistleblower Karen Hughes in my last video, then you can control the way people perceive you too. So just because you don't think of these bank lords as criminal lords of the underworld does not mean that they are not. Because I could be a serial killer, and if I controlled the media, I could get you to think that I was a saint. I have no doubt about that. So what you need to do when you listen to my arguments is just listen to the facts I'm presenting to you. Listen to the facts. So, people say, oh, it's ridiculous to compare working at a hospital funded by Pablo Escobar and working for, say, JP Morgan or HSBC or Goldman Sachs. And I say, why? They say, because you're working for the hospital, you're not working for Pablo Escobar. And I would say, oh, really? Because he funded the whole operation. So anytime he comes in, you would say, like, at that time, if I was working at that hospital, Pablo Escobar came and said, shut down this hospital. It won't be shut down. If he has the power to take away your job, he is your boss. So it is actually the exact same analogy. So there's no difference there. So hopefully you understand by now that bankers are not who you think they are. And not only are bankers not who you think they are, but banks themselves aren't the entities you think that they are. And as always, as I say in every single one of my videos, don't just believe what I'm saying, but always do your own research to either confirm what I'm saying is true, or, you know, if you find information that contradicts what I say, then just let me know in the video comments below. But, you know, I'm always telling, bankers will never tell you to go challenge what they're saying, because they want you to be dumb enough just to obey what they say is the truth when they're just telling flat out lies. So let me give you an example. For example, the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation in the United States, just voted 5-0 to stop insuring all overseas deposits by foreigners in U.S. banks. So the FDIC insures up to $250,000 US per account in the United States, but they voted 5-0 to stop that practice of insuring any overseas accounts. Now think about that for foreigners. Why? Or even actually for expat Americans, as long as it's held over in an overseas branch of a U.S. bank. Now, why is that money overseas different than the money inside the United States? Think about that for a second. It's the same company. Why would they stop insuring it unless there is a problem with the liquidity of these banks? Because they know that Americans will riot if, you know, like Citigroup goes under, well, they're basically bankrupt, about gets, you know, to that point in a little bit. But if they steal the money from Americans like they did in Cyprus, the Americans will probably take guns into the banks and shoot up the banks. But, you know, they feel they can get away with this with foreigners. So that's why they go look this up on the internet if you don't know about this, because it's a fact. So you got to start doing your own research and draw your own conclusions. Now, another fact that's crazy is that, okay, these banks and these shill media, these shill organizations for bankers, like Forbes magazine, like the major media, like the Telegraph in the UK, now they've been basically promoting this agenda that a lot of the most sound gold and silver mining companies are in trouble because of this paper takedown in prices. It's crazy. The paper raid that was enacted by central bankers and various puppet bullion banks of theirs, where they took the price down of gold from 1,600, I believe it was in April, down to, I believe it was like 1184, 1187, somewhere in that area was the low that was hit. Now they said, oh, you must write down your assets. Gold and silver mining companies and Goldcorp followed, and basically they wrote down $1.2 billion of the assets because of the drop of price in paper gold and paper silver, which is crazy because they're telling these mining corporations that you must write down your assets because the value has fallen. But they're asking these companies to mark their gold and silver assets to the fake spot paper prices that the bankers are creating in the gold and silver market. So they're not even the real, because the physical premiums for a lot of this physical gold, say for Shanghai or in India, are 20 to 30, you know, dollars higher than the spot price. So that's the actual price for gold. So if you're going to mark it down, these mining companies shouldn't be marking it down to the spot price. They should be marking it down to what the actual real price of a 1 ounce physical, one ounce of physical gold or 1 ounce of physical silver is. They should be marking it down to the fake, bogus, artificially engineered, bank manipulated spot prices of you know, these commodities, of these precious metals. So they're marking it down to the spot price. They're not even marking it down to the real physical price, which is, you know, the minimum that these mining companies should do. But on the other hand, look at this hypocrisy, because the 10-year Treasury yields just jumped up 100 basis points, which basically caused valuation loss. And all U.S. Treasury bonds, and all these big banks like Bank of America, that Citigroup, J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, you know, the usual suspects in crime, you know, that the assets they hold up billions of dollars, yet they don't mark any of these assets down a penny, not even 1 penny. They mark it to some internal fantasy valuation model because they say, oh, they're not real losses because we haven't sold it yet. But yet, the inventory that these mining companies are holding, physical gold, physical silver, that they're not selling them. And some companies, the smart companies, are actually even holding back the inventory right now, not selling because they feel the prices are too low and they will rise. So they'll wait till the prices rise to sell into the market. They're saying you must write this down right away. So look at the hypocrisy of these. And these banks are saying they're still profitable, they're still viable because they're committing fraud greater than Enron accounting fraud. Greater. They're not marking down their assets to market. They're lying about the valuation. These CEOs are a bunch of lying crooks. And again, this is not something I'm making up. You can go confirm it for yourself by researching the internet that none of these assets that are dropping precipitously in price are being marked down, and that's how these banks are declaring profits. If you look at the derivatives, the 1.2 quadrillion of derivatives that these big global banks hold, they're typically held off balance sheet. So again, these are being marked on Enron fraud-like accounting measures where they might be marking a derivative product that they may get 20 cents to the dollar if they sold it out to the open market today, but yet they're valuing them on their books like 90, 95 cents on the dollar, and they're basically internal fantasy valuation model. So again, the only thing that makes these banks profitable and allows these banking executives to keep taking millions of dollars of salary, of bonuses, per year is Enron-like accounting fraud. Because I can guarantee you, if you take the time to look at all these big global banks, most of the big global U.S. banks are bankrupt today, meaning that their liabilities outweigh their assets, but they're just holding all their bad liabilities off balance sheet or not marketing them to market, marketing them to fantasy valuations while they come down on all these gold and silver mining companies to, you must mark down, you must write down these assets because the price of fake paper spot gold and silver has come down. So think about how ludicrous that is. So you have to realize that even banks are not what you think they are. Okay, so as always, let me know what you think. Let me know if you disagree with that argument, and if you disagree with the argument that I'm comparing basically the bosses of two different crime syndicates, one being a bank cartel and the other being a drug cartel, then please tell me in the comments below. Tell me what good banks are doing for society when you know it's been historically documented all the good things Pablo Escobar did, in addition to, of course, all the terrible things he did as well. But if banks are facilitating, say like HSBC, we know they're facilitating the drug trade, the Sinaloa drug cartel, they're facilitating murders, they're facilitating the distribution of drugs all around the world. By working for this syndicate, is it not the same as working for a hospital Pablo Escobar funded, or a school Pablo Escobar funded, or even a church Pablo Escobar built and funded? What is the difference? Let me know in your comments below. Let me know what other topics you want me to address in the future. Please remember part 2 of my exclusive interview with Karen Hughes, World Bank whistleblower, is coming up very shortly. And if you want to be informed of when we release that, please hit the subscribe button right here. And you'll be notified when that happens. And if you have watched part 1 and are waiting for part 2, please do note that part 2 has some great information, even more explosive than in part 1. So be sure to catch that. As always, I preach to always stay intensely curious. Thanks a lot for watching. Have a great day.